thought what might be good was to run through how I store the produce that comes out of the garden. I've talked before about how I try and run the garden in that it produces food all year round. We're lucky in Auckland, we don't have frost, have cyclones, but we don't have frost, which does mean that we can grow food pretty much all of the year. But of course in the winter things slow down, and in the summer it all speeds up and a lot of stuff comes out of the garden. And I need to preserve that food so that then I can eat that through the year. I thought through everything that I could possibly do to preserve the food, and I also thought about all the implications for the environment of those different ways of preserving the food. So I thought I would run you through all of that thinking today and show you what I settled on as what seemed to me to be the best way of doing it. Obviously this is all I came up with looking on the internet, looking on YouTube and doing the research that I do. But if you have any other ideas, please put it down below. I'd be very interested. So I came up with roughly there being maybe about 3 different ways that I could preserve this food. Bearing in mind that in Auckland we have quite mild and quite moist, humid conditions. I also live in an area which historically has been volcanic, so there's lots of big rocks in the ground. So, you know, digging a root cellar, for instance, was not an option for me because there's lots of rocks in the ground and it would be a very big job and probably not get very far. But what I came up with was dehydrating, canning, bottling, whatever you call it in your country. And then the other option was a freezer. We have a little freezer with our fridge, but that really wasn't going to hack it. We needed more space. Looking at the first option, dehydrating. Obviously there are various ways of doing that. There's a benchtop version, you know, getting an appliance on the benchtop that you plug in. There would be, say, a solar sort of air dryer. I'd love to try that, but I'd need to build it, so it's still on the radar. And then the other one would be sort of like naturally just drying it outside in the air. I did try that and that didn't work. Our environment is too humid. So it really came down to a benchtop dehydrator, which I didn't own, so I would have to buy one of those. I would have to get some airtight containers to keep my dehydrated food in, because otherwise in our moist climate it would rehydrate, sort of go a bit moldy maybe, which again I didn't have. As an initial food storage method, the issue with it was that it really wasn't that appropriate for everything that I wanted to store. I could really see an application for fruit, but with vegetables it would mean that I'd have to rehydrate all of those vegetables when I wanted to use them, and that would take extra time. I have these hooks that I hang the pans on, and I found that they work quite well for drying things like herbs. I just bundle them up, tie them around with string and then hang them up from those hooks. It's well ventilated in here because of our ventilation system. It's not too light and they seem to dry quite well in here. So the second thing that I thought about was sort of bottling, canning if you like. I'm also lumping into that things like jams, jellies, pickling, chutneys, all that type of thing. So with that, again, I didn't have any of the equipment required for that. So I have now got a few preserving jars and I went with Wex jars. I've got a few jars, but again, I'd have to buy a lot of jars and equipment to do that as the main source of storage, food preserving for the garden. The other thing was it takes a lot of time. With my garden being quite small, quite often what happens is I'll get harvest over several days to get enough to do a batch of something. So for instance, at the moment I'm harvesting blackberries, but I don't have enough in one harvest to do anything with them, apart from eat them. I have to do it over several days. And of course with bottling, when you're bottling and canning, you also need to use a new seal every time you do a batch. So when it's opened, you throw the seal away and the next time you use those jars, you have to put a new seal in it. So there is that level of waste with bottling. Obviously the jars and everything can be reused, but there are those seals that need to be thrown away each time. I do jams, chutneys, pickles, those types of things, and I find that works quite well. But quite often what I will do is put that produce in the freezer first, and then when I get enough of something, then I will make it into a chutney or something along those lines. Okay, so this is my pantry, and you can see that I do have, I don't know if you can just see that up there, I do have some Wex jars up there, and I do preserving that way, but not a lot. I also, as you can see up there, do preserve some jams and what have you, chutneys and things up there. So the best solution for me was a freezer, because it was quick. As I harvest things out of the garden, I can just basically blanch them or not and then put them in the freezer, and I can do little bits at a time, and it really doesn't take long. It all just goes in the freezer. But then the big issue with freezing was a waste aspect. Well, there's two things really, a waste aspect and also an energy aspect. So to run a freezer, it is quite a big user of electricity, because it doesn't draw a lot all the time, but because it's on 24 hours a day, over time it does use quite a lot of electricity. It's the same as our fridges and things that are on all of the time. But I suppose when I looked at that energy, I thought about the fact that if I had bought those vegetables from the shop, say, you know, there's all those miles and they would have been in refrigeration, and all of those costs would have existed anyway. So, you know, sometimes you need to give yourself a break and go, well, actually there are going to be impacts, and by growing my own food I am minimizing those impacts. So what I do is I'm very careful about how I use the freezer. So as soon as we explode out of our small freezer, then I'll turn the big freezer on, and that's generally about midsummer, I would say. The freezer is on until late winter, and by that time we've used most of the produce that's in the freezer, and anything that's left in there I can often just squeeze in the small freezer that's attached to our fridge freezer, and at that point I turn it off. The other issue with the freezer is, of course, waste. When you have a freezer, generally the way you would use it is there's a lot of, say, freezer bags and single-use plastic that you would use around a freezer. And that was absolutely a no-go for me. So I looked at all this sort of zero waste online. What could you use in the freezer? And there's all these different ideas that you could use, you know, mason jars, and you can maybe wrap things several times in cloth and all sorts of things to try and get around that idea of freezer burn and make it work. But the more research I did, I found that actually the best option all round was plastic. Obviously I wasn't doing single-use plastic, but then I thought, if I go out and buy a whole bunch of plastic boxes, they will last a long time, they will be used again and again and again, so they won't be single-use. But that still meant that I had to walk out and buy all of this new plastic. And as you know from previous videos, I really try very hard not to buy any new plastic. So that wasn't an option either. And eventually I came up with the idea of buying second-hand plastic boxes. And I was seeing quite often in the charity shops that I was going to, there were quite a number of Sistema boxes in the charity shops. So I believe that I am potentially the world's first plastic box collector, certainly in New Zealand I would think. So I started collecting Sistema boxes when I found them. Secondhand, so I wasn't stimulating the production of new plastic. It was already out there in the world, unwanted, essentially waste. So I was giving to charity at the same time, and I was then using that plastic for a plastic box for my freezer that then would get used again, again and again. So brilliant, win-win all the way around. The other issue was, what was I going to do with all these plastic boxes? Because the freezer's quite large, and if I filled it all with plastic boxes, I was going to have all this Tupperware everywhere, and we don't have a lot of storage. Sometimes I find that part of this sustainable lifestyle that I'm trying to figure out, I just have to think about things from different viewpoints and just try and think about things different ways. And what I realised was that I could store the plastic boxes in the freezer. Sounds a bit obvious, doesn't it? But you don't do that. But if my plastic boxes were only going to be for the freezer, which they are, I really don't use plastic boxes anywhere else in my house. I don't have a need for that. So if they were going to be in the freezer, I would really just start to think of them the same way as they have plastic drawers inside the freezer. I just thought of the plastic boxes as subsections within that. So I collected a whole bunch of plastic boxes, and then when the freezer was off, I worked out the best way of getting them all in the freezer so that they fitted the best way possible and the most efficient use of space. And then once they were in there, they stay in there. If I open this door, hopefully you can see. So in these drawers, I have, open this door, in this drawer, I hope you can see, I have the Tupperware boxes. I'm just needing another Tupperware box from here. I haven't quite finished my collection. But as you can see, I've worked out how they all fit in the best. And then these just pop out and fill up with the produce, and in they go. Now, if you can see, I'm just wondering if lower down I've got some empty boxes. I have. So if you can see down here, that front box is full, but those back boxes are empty, yet to be filled. They just stay there empty until they are full of produce. And that's how I keep it. And at the moment, the top 3.5 drawers are pretty much full, but lower down isn't. And so when I have produce, I just basically pull out one of the plastic boxes, put the produce in that plastic box, and then put it back in the freezer. And so then I know that this particular box is being filled up with beans, this one is being filled up with elderberries, this one is being filled up with pasta sauce blocks. I make pasta sauce, and I make what I call pucks, little sort of like I got this. I'll show you actually. This is my small freezer. Basically, I have this fridge, and the bottom part is a freezer. And I'm just going to show you how I make my pucks. So it's just a little 3-drawer freezer section down here. But if I pull this drawer out, you can see that I am currently making some little pucks. I got these from an op shop, and they're very useful. I think they're like little loaf things. They're not very deep. This is partially frozen. I don't want to disturb it. But this is pasta sauce from tomatoes from the garden. I make pucks of spinach. So when spinach comes out of the garden, or chard, or those types of things, I will wilt it all down and then make these little pucks. So I have a lot of little sort of ready meal parcels, if you like, in the freezer, and we just take out the pucks and then use them. And I do smaller versions with ice cube trays for smaller bits of produce. I also have these, and these again are sort of silicone, and I found these in a charity shop, and they're brilliant for smaller things like herbs, or I've used them for things like orange juice and those type of things. And they're great to get out because you just can pop them out really easily. So all of these things get collected in the different Tupperware boxes. When I want to use them, I just get the right Tupperware box out, take the food out, and then when that box is finished, it comes out, gets washed, and then goes right back into its slot. So that way I don't have a whole bunch of Tupperware floating around my house in drawers. I never lose the lids to the Tupperware boxes because they're always together in the freezer, and it works really, really well. So I just thought I'd share with you how I work my zero waste freezer. Essentially, all the Tupperware has come from charity shops, it's all recycled, and then I just store it all in the freezer, and I just use it as sort of compartments in the freezer. It works an absolute treat, and I'm really pleased with my solution. So if you're struggling with how to be more sustainable and get away from the freezer bags and throw away things that you use in the freezer, maybe have a think about that and see if that sort of system would work for you.